Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to start talking about fish. So this is going to start looking familiar to you because most of us know about fish, but we get to look at some of the details and some things you may not know. So let's get started with that. First of all, this is where we're going to be looking today. We have started talking about chordates, and we've talked about our tunicates and lancelets already. Y'all are going to laugh at me. I call that lancelot all the time. So bad. Okay, lancelets and tunics. We've looked at those. And then, so now we are moving on to our fish. And they are divided into those that have jaws. These that have jaws and those that do not. And then out of those that have jaws, we have those that have a cartilaginous skeleton and those that have a bony skeleton. And further broken down for the bony skeleton are those with ray fins versus lobed fins. So see, you didn't even know that fish were broken down into all those categories, did you? All right, so we are going to be looking at our fish today. So what actually defines a fish? There are 5 different features that are necessary for you to put an animal in the category of a fish. So one is that they have to be ectothermic. This is what used to be called cold-blooded. Ectothermic just means that the body temperature of that organism is regulated by the external environment that it lives in. So fish are ectothermic. They have a single loop closed vascular system. Previously, you have looked at the difference between an open and a closed vascular system. Now, as we're getting into the closed system, there are a couple of different varieties in that, so we'll take a look at that. Fish have gills as their primary means of gas exchange. They have fins, or at least most of them do, and they live in a water habitat. So those features are what define a fish. So there are a couple of features that I do want to talk about that most fish have, but not all. And the first is what we call a swim bladder. And I'm going to show you pictures of these things right now. We're just going to talk about it a little bit. But for now, the swim bladder is what allows a fish to be buoyant within the water column. And it's created by an outpocketing from the digestive system. And it can either be filled with gas or oil, depending on the fish. And it kind of works as a ballast, and so it allows the fish to maintain a particular, a particular space within the water column. So if it wants to be, 2 feet from the surface, it can maintain that level, and that allows it to move and swim without either sinking or going up. We don't see those in cartilaginous fish, but it is present in bony fish. So that's the swim bladder. The other thing that's present is a lateral line, and that's unique to, again, to aquatic vertebrates. So what that does is it serves to detect movement and pressure changes in the surrounding water. And so it has a series of mechanoreceptors called neuromasts, and that allows the fish to be responsive to its surroundings. So just kind of like an extrasensory type of organ. And then, of course, scales. Many fish have scales. It's sort of like a extra protective coating to protect its body. So those are just some additional features seen in most fish. Okay, so we talked about a closed system, a closed circulatory system. That means that these animals are using blood, and that blood is maintained within arteries, capillaries, that sort of thing. So they are contained. And fish have a single loop closed circulatory system. And that means that it has 2 chambers to the heart, the atria and the ventricle. So in this sense, the ventricle side of the heart pumps out deoxygenated blood, and that blood then passes through the capillaries where gas exchange occurs in the gills and allows that blood to be oxygenated and then it circulates back to other capillaries, for instance in the muscles where that oxygen is required, and gas exchange occurs across those capillaries, and then the deoxygenated blood comes back into the atrial chamber of the heart. So two-chambered heart, single loop. Okay, that's how our fish circulatory system works. So here's the lateral line that we were talking about, and it's going to be very familiar to you when you look at fish. If you've ever dealt with fish at all, whether eating them or catching them, you'll notice that line that's right across here. It runs the length of their body, and it usually does divide it by some section. Like for instance, in this particular fish, you can note that this part down here has larger scales, this part up here has smaller scales. That's pretty typical. But that lateral line is that sensory system that allows the fish to know what's going on in the water around it. And the way that it does that, it is that it has neuromasts all throughout that lateral line. And so here is the opening to the water, and the water actually comes through this lateral line. And as it comes through, it crosses over these neuromasts. And the neuromasts have a part that goes into the lateral line called the capula that has sensory hairs in it. And those sensory hairs are connected to sensory cells that are then connected to nerve tissue. And so when there is a change in the water pressure around it, let's just say a predator fish comes swimming by or swimming close to it, that causes a pushing of the water towards the prey fish, and they can feel that change in water pressure using this lateral line. So that's how they know predators are coming, that's how they know where their prey is, things like that. And so it's just an extra way that fish get to sense what's going on in their environment, because their eyesight is okay, but it's not fantastic. So like I said, just an extra way of knowing what's going on in the environment. So here is our swim bladder that we talked about, and that's our buoyancy organ. It's right here, and it comes from an outpocketing of the digestive system. And most of the time it's going to be filled with a gas. In some fish it is filled with an oil instead. But this allows the fish to manipulate what's in its, or the amount that's in its swim bladder, so it can either move up or down in the water column as necessary. And you're going to see this when we do our dissection in lab. We'll do a dissection of a perch, and you'll get to see it. That swim bladder is made up of a very fine tissue, so sometimes it's a little difficult to see it in lab, but we will work on that together so you get a chance to look at it. So let's take a look at the different types of fish that we have. Obviously, we are looking at vertebrates now, and when we look at our fish, we divide them into 3 different groups. The first is what we call Agnetha. Those are our primitive fish. So if we were looking at macroevolution, these would have come along first. So they're the more simple of the fish. And they are jawless, and they also do not have scales. They have a cartilaginous skeleton, so no bone. And the 2 primary fish that are in this category are what we call the hagfish and lampreys. So they're going to make up class Agnetha. Our second group of fish is class Chondrichthyes, and these are our cartilaginous fish that have jaws. And these are our sharks, skates, and rays. And then our third category is class Osteichthyes, and that's our bony fish. Again, they have jaws as well, and that's all, pretty much all the rest of the fish that you think about. Salmon, tuna, trout, bass, pompano, which is what we have here. All of those are bony fish. So let's start with our class Agnetha. Like I said, they are some of the simpler fish, so they're thought to be the connector between chordates and vertebrates. And just a couple of things that mark this class. Like I said, they're cartilaginous still. They're jawless. They do still have a notochord, but they don't have vertebrae. They do have what's called arcuae, and that is above and sometimes around the notochord, so that kind of helps protect that notochord. They have a partial skull, but not a full skull, and they have cylindrical bodies. Like I said, no scales. They can be either filter feeders or parasites. So this top one is a hagfish, and the image on the bottom is a lamprey. Those are the two that fit into our class Agnetha. Hagfish. So how do you tell the difference between hagfish and a lamprey? They're actually pretty easy to tell the difference, to be honest. The hagfish have 6 tentacles that work around its mouth to help it hold on to things. And they're just scavengers. They kind of eat anything that comes along. The mark of them is that they're very, very slimy, and that discourages predators from biting into their body, discourages people from picking them up for sure. But that they're this cylindrical, slimy fish. Not the prettiest thing you've ever seen. Okay, and then there's the lamprey. Okay, these aren't quite as ugly as the hagfish. So a couple of features that mark the lamprey and make them different than our hagfish is particularly these external gill slits. There are 7 of them, and they are right behind the eye. And then they have what's called this buccal funnel, and we're going to take a closer look at that in a minute. Here's what they look like in real life down here. I'm not sure if you've heard of lamprey before, but I bet this next slide will trigger some memories if you have. So our lamprey, with this lovely buccal funnel, also has all these suckers and these kind of teeth that dig into the side of their prey, because these are parasites. They live on the side of fish. They have they rasp out a circle, as you can see right here, and then they just feed on the blood from the fish. So they are definitely parasites. So lamprey are actually pretty interesting if you look at their life cycle. So what we usually think of as the lamprey are the adult version, where they attach to the fish and they can cause damage to the fish. They don't often kill them, but sometimes they do. And normally they can live in the oceans, but we have had some invasions into, I believe, into the Great Lakes area. But the way this works is typically you have the adult version feeds on its prey, but then when it's ready to mate, it swims upstream, and the male adult will swim upstream first and start preparing beds. And when they do this, they can spend a long time. They can spend even a year getting ready for the female. And once they do decide to swim upstream, they no longer eat. So they basically will feed on their prey while they're out in the ocean, or in this case in the lakes. But once they swim upstream, there's no more eating. And they will prepare a bed, and they secrete basically pheromones that attract the female lamprey to start coming up into those streams as well. And once they have attracted a female to their bed, then they basically spray sperm, and then the females spray their eggs. Once fertilization occurs, then the small larvae emerge, and then they begin to burrow into the ground, and they are filter feeders at that point. And then at some point in their lives, once they reach a kind of a adolescent stage, then they will swim back downstream and out into the lakes or to the ocean, and then as the adult version, they will start feeding on fish. So once they're in the adult version, they kind of have like a bluish tint to them. They're actually not too bad to look at. Once they begin to come upstream and they're fasting, they start to have a slightly brown look to them. Once they have mated, they're done. So that's what that life cycle looks like. So here is just an example of a particular one that lives in New Zealand, Geatria australis. And so if you look at the distribution of these lamprey, it's not surprising that they are all right along the coastal edge because they live their adult life in the ocean, and then when they go to spawn, they go up these rivers, and New Zealand has quite a few rivers. So that's what the distribution looks like. I did want to show this to you just to let you know that the indigenous people in New Zealand used to catch these lampreys as they were coming upriver to spawn, and they had these fish baskets. So if you look in this picture right here, that's what it looked like. And they would catch them and then they grill them and eat them. So they have these festivals, I think once a year if I'm correct, where they use the traditional baskets and they catch lamprey and they grill them and eat them. So the population of them has gone down, so they don't catch as many as they used to, but this is still a tradition of the indigenous people in New Zealand. So just wanted to let you know somebody eats these things. Okay, let's start talking about our fishes with jaws. I do really feel like we should have some Jaws music going here. Dun, 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 dun. But this is our class Chondrichthyes is where we're going to start with our jawed fish. And these are our sharks, our skates, and our rays. And they have a cartilaginous skeleton. They do still have gill slits on both sides of their pharynx. And unlike the bony fish, they lack a gill cover, so their gills are just exposed. And kind of unique to this group is that they have spiracles. Spiracles are openings to the gill chambers that are located behind the eyes, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. And then they have denticles is what they're called. They're kind of teeth-like scales. So if you have ever been able to rub your hand across a shark's body, you know that it almost feels like sandpaper, and that's because of these denticles. So let's take a closer look at these denticles. So like I said, they're kind of like scales. They're fairly small, and they overlap one another. And the tip of them are overlaid with enamel. So just like your teeth, they're made of dentine, and then they have enamel on top of them. So they're very protective, actually. In this other picture up to the right, you'll see the spiracles. Like we said, they are right behind the eyes of the shark. And what that allows for is when sharks tend to rest, they don't sleep on the bottom like people think. They need to constantly be in motion because they do not have a swim bladder. A swim bladder would allow them to sit in one place within the water column, but a shark doesn't have that, so it will tend to sink to the bottom a little bit. But what the spiracle does is it allows water to still flow through the spiracle and out across the gills, so that there's a little bit more gas exchange happening when they aren't swimming quickly. So it's just an extra way to have gas exchange. Okay, one thing about our ray skin is that it doesn't have the dermal teeth that you see in the sharks, but on the back of or on the upper tail surface, the dermal teeth have developed large, strong spines. So when you see a ray, that is something that's unique about them, is that spine. And some of you will remember that because of the accident that occurred with the crocodile hunter. I don't know why his name is Steve Irwin. Okay, there we go. that was such a fluke accident, not something that would normally happen, but the spine of a ray did get into his heart. So that's that tough dermal tissue with the enamel overlay. So they are very sharp and very hard. Okay, let's take a look at the body of our Chondrichthyes and what the different fins are used for. So easiest thing, let's start with our shark. So we talked about our spiracles being behind the eyes so that water can go and pass over the gills when they're in a more of a resting state, so that's super important. When we're looking at the fins, we have a dorsal fin here and often a secondary dorsal fin as well. We have the caudal fin, which is always that last back one. And then we have, oh, where'd my little cursor go? We have the pectoral fin. That's the easiest to remember because you know where your pecs are. They're attached in the same place. There's a pelvic fin, and there's an anal fin. So let's talk first about this pelvic fin because it's unique in males. In males, it's modified as a copulatory organ. Class Chondrichthyes does have internal fertilization. So when we do a dissection of the dogfish shark, you'll be able to tell the males specifically because they have these copulatory organs or these claspers. Okay, but let's talk about the rest of these fins and what they're used for. So the caudal fin here in the back, that's exactly what you would think it was used for. It is to propel the shark forward. So as it's swimming, that's what causes that forward motion. The dorsal fin provides balance. So the fish, when it's being moved forward, it has a fairly round torpedo-like body. So if you think about how torpedoes work, if you're moving fast in a forward motion, it tends to spiral, right? Well, that dorsal fin stops that spiral motion for sharks. It helps keep the balance. And then the pectoral fins are used for an upward force and also for steering. And the pelvic fin also helps to be, pelvic and anal fins essentially help to act sort of as a rudder. So they also help a little bit in steering. In our rays and our skates, the flattened body and the rear spines of the rays make their swimming motion unique and completely different from that of sharks. So particularly in rays, their large flattened body becomes fused with the pectoral fins. So it's what makes up this disc. And that is used to produce vertical waves from the front to the rear, similar to birds, and that's how they get through the water, is they make that vertical wave. So that's just kind of unique to our rays. And then if you look here, the males still have claspers, and then their dorsal fins are back here and much smaller, so they're a little bit modified. So how do we know the difference between skates and rays? We have a lot of skates here off the coast of North Carolina. Any of you have been fishing off the pier, oftentimes you pull up skates left and right, and that's not what you're fishing for. We all know that. Rays, we can have those here. They tend to be more predominant in warmer waters. That's why you'll often see them in the Caribbean or even off the coast of Florida. So let's just look at some differences because you'll actually see examples of these in lab and you'll have to be able to tell the difference between the two. Rays, when they give birth to live young. That's what we call viviparous. And if you remember your Latin, because it's always helpful in science, vivi right here, that's going to mean live. So in this instance, porous really means birth, so live birth, if you think of it that way. So those are rays. The skates, on the other hand, are egg-bearing, OV. OVI refers to, sorry, my cursor is completely in the wrong place, refers to egg-bearing. So skates bear eggs, rays give birth to live young. Rays have a longer, skinnier tail, and they have that spine that we talked about, that spike that comes from that dental surface. Skates have a fleshier tail and no spine. Rays have plate-like teeth, and skates have very small teeth. So which is which? I'm going to give you like just a minute, and you try to come up with which one you think is a skate and which one you think is the ray. Okay, did you come up with it? So this one right here on the left is a ray. The one on the right is a skate. Excuse me. Another way to tell the difference for me is that nose portion. In a skate, it tends to be a little pointier, typically speaking, and in a ray, it's a little more blunt. Okay? So within the class Chondrichthyes, we see all three of the different types of birthing methods. So let's just mention that real quickly, and so that you understand the terms. As we mentioned before, ovo usually refers to egg, VV refers to live birth. So oviparous, excuse me, are egg layers, just straight out egg layers. Ovoviviparous, that means that they have eggs, but they hatch within the female, and then the female gives birth to a live young. And then viviparous are young developing in utero, similar to mammals. They have a yolk sac developing into a yolk placenta that provides nutrients to the embryo. And so that's how that occurs. And you can see the different pictures here of each one. Oftentimes at the beach you may see these shark eggs. And by the time we see them and they wash up on shore, they're usually black. So that might be familiar to you. But we do have them laying eggs, giving birth to live young, or even the ovoviviparous, where the eggs hatch within the female and then the live birth is given. Okay, so in class Chondrichthyes, all the fish in class Chondrichthyes are carnivores. So that's an important distinction. And when we take a look at it, of course, we all say, oh yes, of course, because Jaws is in there, right? Yes, that is true. He is definitely a meat eater, the great white shark. But actually the largest of the class Chondrichthyes is actually what we call the whale shark. And that's this lovely fish right here. He's bigger than the great whites, and he is not a predator in the sense that you think of with the great white. He doesn't have all those big teeth, and in fact, he filter feeds on small fish. So he swallows a bunch of water and catches all those small fish, and then water goes back out through its gills. But he is the largest of our class Chondrichthyes, and it's called the whale shark. Okay, now we're going to move on to our third class of fish, and this is the class Osteichthyes. So these are our bony fish, meaning that they have a skeleton made up of bone. So some unique features there: they do have the swim bladder that we talked about. They have a very well-developed nervous system and brain. They have an operculum, which is different from our class Chondrichthyes. That is basically a covering that covers their gills. And we'll take a look at that. They have separate sexes, and they have external fertilization. If you'll remember, some in the class Chondrichthyes, in fact it might even be all of them, have internal fertilization. So class Osteichthyes have external fertilization. So let's take a look at the anatomy of our class Chondrichthyes. Let me find my little pointer here. Okay, So we definitely have a swim bladder. That allows for it to figure out where it is in the water column and stay there. Its respiratory system is through gills, and they have the covering right here. That's what we call the operculum. That's what covers those gills. Similarly to our class Chondrichthyes, we have dorsal fins. Sometimes there are more of those up here. And then there's the caudal fin, which is it's the tail fin. They have the anal fin, and they have the pelvic fin. So note that they do not have the claspers that we saw in our sharks because we have external fertilization, not internal fertilization. But of course, we have this skeleton here made of bone. And most of the rest of these are going to be what you would normally see anywhere else. And of course, it has a lateral line as well, if you look at the external anatomy. Now, there are all kinds of modifications to the various fins, so that actually makes this a very neat class to look at. Right here in our lionfish, they have enlarged pectoral fins that they can fan out and use it to make them look like they're a lot bigger when they have a predator coming towards them. Then our little seahorse has this tiny little dorsal fin, and they actually use that to propel them forward instead of a caudal fin. So that's kind of neat. And then for our flying fish, they have extremely large pectoral fins, and they do actually leap out of the water sometimes as well. It's just kind of, they get a little bit of extra oxygen, and they get to view the water down below them a little differently. I used to see these all the time when we lived in Fort Lauderdale. If we'd go out on the boat, you could see them hopping out of the water all the time. And then down here, the swordfish. So cool that they have this big sword on the front that they really do use to impale their prey. And they have a very sleek body with a huge caudal fin that allows them to swim very quickly. So neat little adaptations within the class Osteichthyes. So within our bony fish, we have ray-finned fish and lobed-finned fish. So let's start with our ray-finned fish. So if you think about the bony part, it's mostly made up of collagen, which is a growing tissue. And the collagen is a protein that provides a soft framework. And then calcium phosphate is added to it, and that's a mineral that adds strength and hardens the framework. So the combination of collagen and calcium makes the bones strong, but still flexible and able to withstand stress. So that's what the bones are made up of in our bony fish. And so when we take a look at our ray-finned fish, it's very obvious to see this right here fans out like rays coming out. So if we look down here, we're looking at the pectoral fins, and you can see how the bones come out in a ray fashion. So almost like if you think of the paper fans that people use, where they have the ribs that come out, and then, or the rays, and then that nice thin paper. Well, that's sort of how the ray fins work. And this is just a lovely picture of the operculum that covers its gills, so I just wanted to throw that in there as well while we take a look at that. Our lobed fin fish, there's really, the main one that people talk about is the lungfish. And if you look up here on the top right, it kind of compares the different appendages. So here we have our lovely human, and with all our phalanges, and our ray finned that we said, come out from a kind of a central area and just fan out like that. Our lobed fin fish, such as the lungfish, it really is exactly that. It is a lobe, and from it then we have all these areas that come out individually. Okay? And that's how the lobe fin comes to be. So they're not super pretty fish, the ones down here on the bottom. They tend to live in areas that can dry out, so tend to be slightly shallower surfaces. And lungfish are unique in that they have lungs as well as gills. So if you're looking at the theory of macroevolution, they were thought to give rise to amphibians. They're supposed to be that connector species. So they live in an environment where the water dries up and they have to rely on their lungs. And sometimes they have one lung and sometimes they have two, but they have to rely on those to obtain oxygen. And their lung is a modified swim bladder. So it works for air exchange as well as waste removal, but also allows them to move up and down within the water column when there's water present. So this is how it works with our lungfish, because they do have lungs and gills. So let's see, where should we start? So when the water comes, blood comes out of the heart into the gills to allow for oxygenation of the blood, and then it can circulate back through the muscles and into the heart. Our single loop system, just like we've had before. But this time it has two different options for pathways, because the blood can come out of the heart and up to through the gills and then also through the lungs. And that allows it to have extra oxygenation, and then it can go back through its normal process to the muscles. So either direction, it will come through the gills, but it may additionally go through the lungs in order to gather more oxygen to be taken to the muscles. The other thing is the lobed fins that we talked about. They're usually much thicker than a ray fin, and so they can also be used to prop the fish up, almost kind of like little arms. When the water starts to dry up and they're exposed, then those fins can support some of the weight of the body of the fish. Okay, so when we've been talking about fish, most of those fish are going to occur, if we're talking about ocean fish and not, obviously we have a lot of fish in the lakes and rivers, but if we're talking about the ocean, most of our fish are going to be in what's called the epipelagic zone. And pelagic just means of or relating to the open sea. So epi being the top part of the open sea. And so most fish that we encounter are going to live in this epipelagic zone. As we go further down the water column, we start to lose light. So further and further down means less light. It also usually means less oxygen, because most of our photoautotrophs are going to live up here where the sunlight is, and they produce oxygen. So the further down you go, the less oxygen, the less sunlight, and also much colder temperatures. That's not to say that our deeper waters are void of animal life, because that's actually just not true. And so that's something that I find very fascinating, because there are places in the deep ocean, either in the abyss or in the hadal zone, that just have not been explored yet. And I think it's very cool that there's a place still on Earth that is yet to be explored. But we have seen some things from it. We do have a little bit of research that's gone into it. So since we're talking about fish, I want to just talk about the deep sea fish that we do know about. And for that, we're going to be talking about either in the abyssopelagic or in the hadal zone. So that's what I mean by the deep sea. So, very unique features. So, some of the environmental factors that you have to think about that these fish deal with that other fish do not is the immense pressure from a whole water column that's on top of them, the cold temperatures, the lack of light. So food scarcity and difficulty in finding a mate. So for that reason, deep sea fish have unique adaptations to their environment. The first is that they have no swim bladder, and even if they're bony fish. And the reason for that is because the swim bladder, if it's made up of gases act differently under immense pressure. So that doesn't work very well. They have very slow metabolism, which you would expect when there's food scarcity, then that metabolism has to be pretty slow. Interestingly, the cell membranes have more unsaturated fats, because saturated fatty acids make membranes less fluid, while unsaturated fats make the membranes more fluid, so they're able to handle that pressure. They also have what's called piezolites that bind to water and keep proteins from changing shape. And so that's extremely necessary, again, for the immense pressure that these fish are under. Oftentimes they will have a bioluminescence feature to them. So like our anglerfish up here in the top right, they have bioluminescence that really acts like an attractant for their prey and kind of like a fishing lure. So that's why he's called the anglerfish. And then, of course, he has these huge teeth, so that if a fish does happen to come by and is attracted to its bioluminescence, you don't want to miss that opportunity, because they're not going to come by very often. So large mouth, big teeth, you got to get it first time. So he's uniquely adapted for that. Sometimes you can see right here with our Sloan's viperfish, he has some bioluminescence along its lateral line. He can use that to attract mates. And again, viperfish has those huge teeth, so if it has the opportunity to catch its prey, it doesn't want to miss out. That they have a very sensitive lateral line. We talked before about how lateral lines are used to sense what's going on around the fish in the water column. Well, those deep sea fish, they have extra sensitive lateral lines. And depending on their position, so when you look at the neuromasts within the lateral line, depending on their position in the sensory plate, those hair cells have different morphologies and may be tuned even to different frequencies, which I think is very cool. So depending on where they are, what they're looking for, they can tune their neuromasts to different frequencies within the water. So they may be looking for a mate, or they may be looking for a prey. They may be looking out for danger, and they can tune that to different frequencies. The other features is that oftentimes these fish don't have eyes. If they do, they're very rudimentary. Sometimes they're non-functional eyes because they don't have any light. So other than the bioluminescence that's possessed down there, they often don't see light. So just to point out this lovely blobfish, it makes me laugh. He does not look like this in the water column. This is because everything that holds its body up within that immense pressure and cold, once you bring it up, he doesn't look the same anymore. So, but he is called the blobfish, and he actually has a lot of those unsaturated fatty acids throughout its body. So those are just some unique features of fish that live in the deep sea. So just something to be thinking about that maybe we don't talk about very often, and there's so much more to learn about that area. So I'm excited to see what comes next when people discover more fish and more organisms that live in the deep sea. Okay, let's move on to amphibians. We've gone through fish, now we're moving on. We've started sort of in the water, now we're starting to come onto land, but still with a connection to water. Still, water is extremely important to amphibians. So just to show you kind of where we are, we are still in chordates, of course. And now we're coming in here to our amphibians. And what's unique is that they are tetrapods. So just as you might expect, tetra meaning 4, pods meaning feet. So now we have 4 feet that we have not seen before. So far we've had fins. So that's unique to this group of organisms. So characteristics of amphibians. Like we said, limbs is going to be 1, particularly 4 limbs. And now instead of having just gills, now we've moved on and we have lungs. Their skin is smooth, it's not scaly. They go through what's called cutaneous respiration. So in addition to lungs, they have gas exchange that occurs across their skin. And that is the reason that amphibians still require a very moist environment. They have a double loop circulatory pathway, still closed circulatory pathway, but remember with fish we had a single loop. Now we have a double loop. Amphibians are ectothermic. Again, their body temperature is regulated by their external environment. And their reproduction is still an aquatic reproduction. So they can't do that on dry land by themselves. So that is a characteristic of amphibians. Okay, so looking at our lovely amphibians, like we said, they are typically tetrapods, meaning 4 feet. And I guess I should go ahead and say kind of what's in this group, right? We do have our frogs, our toads, our salamanders. And one thing that's very unique to this group, this class, that's extremely important is their cutaneous respiration. So they keep their skin moist so that gas exchange can occur across their skin. They do have lungs, but they're not large, they're not well developed. So they rely on their skin for gas exchange, and that becomes very important. If a frog or a salamander gets dried out, that can't occur. So we need to keep them in a moist environment. So here's just a look to compare what lungs look like. Here is our amphibians. Here's our salamander. They have very tiny, simple air sacs. When you get to frogs that are still in class Amphibia, they have these air sacs, but they are starting to have some branching and compartmentalization. Not a lot, but a little bit. And if you look at them in comparison to their body, their lungs are actually pretty small. And we'll be looking at that in lab as well. You'll get to see what these lungs look like, and hopefully we can compare those to other lungs as well. Yes, so this is what it's going to look like in lab. And by comparison to the size of the body, these lungs are very small. So lungs do transport oxygen to the blood as well as remove waste like carbon dioxide. But again, cutaneous respiration is very necessary because their lungs are very small and not well developed. Okay, so if you'll remember, our fish had a 2-chambered heart. What's unique about our amphibians and most reptiles is that they have a 3-chambered heart. It consists of 2 atria and 1 ventricle. So here, and here. Those are our 2 atria. Okay, so blood leaving the ventricle passes into one of 2 vessels, 2 different directions. It can either travel through the pulmonary arteries that lead to the lungs and the skin where they get oxygen, or they can lead to the rest of the body, which is usually musculature. So the oxygenated blood returning to the heart from the lungs through the pulmonary vein passes into the left atrium, Okay, so that's right here. And the deoxygenated blood returning from the body through the sinus venosus passes into the right atrium, that being right here. And both of the atria empty into the single ventricle right here. And so that allows for the oxygen-rich blood to mix with the oxygen-depleted blood. And that assures that some blood always passes to the lungs and the skin and then back to the heart. So it's not quite as efficient as a 4-chambered system, which keeps the two circuits separate, but it seems to be sufficient for these amphibians. So this is where we have a 3-chambered heart system, and it's a closed system, but it is a 2-loop process. You have your loop up here and your loop down here. Okay? Okay, amphibian reproduction. If you have ever been a kid near any body of water, you probably know more about this than you think you do. First of all, frogs are sexually mature by about 3 years. And so fertilization occurs in the water, and the male clasps the female, and eggs are fertilized as they are shed. So as the eggs are coming out, the sperm is released and they are fertilized. And then the eggs are surrounded by like a jelly coat. So lots of people have seen frog eggs. They kind of look like this. We used to see them in pools in South Florida, actually. And then, of course, cleavage occurs, which you guys should know by now. And then as the embryo begins to develop, then we start to see a tadpole. So come on, how many of us have caught tadpoles? I bet all of us. So they do have a tail. They have external gill slits that will develop eventually into their lungs. They have a spiracle even. And then as they start to metamorphosize, then they begin to develop hind limbs and then forelimbs, and then their tail is reabsorbed. And then they become mature frogs, and the process can start all over again. So I'm guessing that you knew a lot about that already. Just kind of important that all of this takes place in an aquatic environment. Okay, there are 3 different groups of amphibians that we're going to talk about. The first are salamanders and newts. Those have 2 pairs of appendages, a long tail, limbs are at right angles to the body. They move in a sinusoidal motion, which is like an S-like motion, and they are carnivorous. In fact, all amphibians are carnivorous, just so you know. And they do internal fertilization. And then we're going to look at frogs and toads. Again, they're carnivorous. They have 2 pairs of appendages. They have a gland in the skin that produces poisons, so that's pretty unique to them. They do also have a tympanic membrane, or a tympanum, which basically works kind of like the tympanic membrane in your ear. It can sense vibrations, and we'll use that in lab to determine if our frog is a male or female, because depending on the size of that tympanum, it can tell you if it's a male or female. Frogs and toads undergo external fertilization, like we just talked about a minute ago. It requires an aquatic environment, but with frogs and toads, that's external. And then we have this group over here that you probably didn't even know were amphibians, and it's called a Sicilian, which, yes, makes it sound like they're from Italy, and not at all what that word looks like, but that's how you pronounce it. And they do not have limbs. They're the only amphibians that don't. And they are often sightless, and they're worm-shaped. So if you look at them, they look a lot like an earthworm, right? But they functionally are not like an earthworm. They have jaws and teeth. They eat insects, termites, and they even eat earthworms. They actually are bigger than earthworms. I know you can't tell that from this picture. But so these are our 3 groups of amphibians. Okay, this is one that I wanted to talk about for sure. This is the hellbender, and it is in that category with salamanders and newts. It is the largest salamander known, and the reason that I wanted to bring it up and that it's important is because it lives in the streams and rivers in our North Carolina mountains. And it is used as what we call a bioindicator species. And let me go to the next slide. A bioindicator species just means that we can determine the health of the ecosystem, like the water quality, by looking at the presence, the abundance, the health of the hellbender. And the hellbender is very sensitive to silt and pollution, so they're a good indicator of water quality in our streams and our rivers. So if you look at the distribution of the hellbender, they are right here along our western limit of North Carolina, all along those mountains, like the Allegheny Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains. So sometimes their nickname is the Allegheny alligator, and they live in rivers with high water flow, and that's because high water flow means more aeration, which is what this particular salamander needs. And so some of the rivers that they're located in are the New River, the Watauga, the French Broad, the Little Tennessee, and the Hiawassee. Important to me because those are all wonderful whitewater paddling rivers, and so I want to know that the quality of water in those is really good. So I'm happy when I see hellbenders. You don't see them very often. Just like most salamanders, they like to hide sort of underneath rocks, and but because they're over a foot long, sometimes they don't hide that well. Oftentimes they're killed because people get scared of them. Because if you saw something like that, you might not know what it was, want to kill it, but they are completely harmless. They are a little slimy, but other than that, they're very harmless, and they are a bioindicator species for our rivers. So this is just one last picture of the hellbender. Like I said, largest salamander known. It's supposedly been around a very long time. And our own North Carolina Zoo opened an exhibit on the hellbender because most people don't get to see it. It is a nocturnal feeder, so it's very quiet during the day, so most people wouldn't see them. So if you have the opportunity to go to the zoo, this is definitely one exhibit you don't want to miss. So here is something that I will just add in here. If you will take a moment, you can read the article about the hellbender. I've shown you the link up here on the top left. I will give you some extra credit on your next lecture exam if you will send me an email and tell me one of the many nicknames of our hellbender. And you can't use Allegheny alligator because that is one that I've already given you, but if you can come up with another one and send it to me, it will be worth extra credit points on your next lecture exam. Okay, hope you enjoyed today about fish and amphibians, and I will see you next time.